The stagecoach rattled into Albuquerque, New Mexico on a scorching afternoon in July of 1878, and Delilah Carson pressed her hand against her abdomen, willing the nausea to subside long enough to make it to the boarding house without incident. She had traveled 300 miles from Santa Fe with nothing but 2 carpetbags and a secret that grew heavier with each passing week. And now, as the driver helped her down onto the dusty street, she steadied herself against the wheel and took in the sight of the town that would either save her or condemn her. The sun beat down mercilessly on the adobe buildings that lined the main street, and Delilah could feel sweat trickling down her spine beneath her traveling dress. She had chosen the garment carefully before leaving Santa Fe, selecting a style with a loose bodice and flowing skirt that would hide what needed hiding for as long as possible. At 3 months along, she still looked merely well-fed rather than expectant, but she knew her time was limited before questions would be asked and assumptions would be made. She retrieved her bags from the coach driver and made her way toward the boarding house that had been recommended in the advertisement she had seen back in Santa Fe. The position as a seamstress at the local dress shop was the lifeline she desperately needed, a chance to start over in a place where nobody knew her story or cared to ask about the missing husband who should have accompanied a woman in her condition. The boarding house was run by a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Patterson, who took one look at Delilah and quoted a price that would consume most of her meager savings within a month. Delilah accepted without negotiation, too exhausted from the journey to haggle, and followed the landlady up a narrow staircase to a small room that overlooked the street. The space contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings, but it was clean and private, and that was all she needed. After Mrs. Patterson departed with instructions about meal times and house rules, Delilah sank onto the bed and allowed herself a moment of weakness. Tears pricked at her eyes as she thought of how different her life had looked just 6 months ago, when she had believed herself to be genuinely courted by Thomas Whitmore, the banker's son who had promised her the world and delivered nothing but shame. He had disappeared the moment she revealed her condition, leaving town with his family's blessing and a fresh start in California, while she had been left to face the consequences alone. Her own family had been no better. Her father had called her a disgrace, and her mother had wept behind closed doors, but neither had offered the support she desperately needed. Instead, they had suggested she go away somewhere quiet and give up the child when it came, then return home as though nothing had happened. But Delilah had felt the tiny flutter of life inside her and knew she could never give up this baby, not when it was the only family she would have left in the world. So she had taken what little money she had saved from her work at the millinery shop, purchased a simple gold band from a pawnbroker, and invented a dead husband named Mr. Carson, who had tragically perished in a mining accident. The story was common enough that nobody would question it too closely, and the ring on her finger would ward off unwanted advances and provide a veneer of respectability. The next morning, Delilah reported to the dress shop, as instructed in the letter she had received accepting her application. The owner was a Frenchwoman named Madame Bouchard, who examined Delilah's sample stitching with a critical eye before nodding her approval. The work would be demanding, Madame explained in heavily accented English, and the hours would be long, but the pay was fair and there would be opportunities for additional income during the busy seasons when the ranchers' wives came to town for new gowns. Delilah threw herself into the work with desperate intensity, arriving early each morning and staying late into the evening to prove her worth. She altered dresses and mended tiers, constructed entire garments from bolts of fabric, and embroidered delicate flowers onto collars and cuffs. Her fingers grew calloused, and her eyes strained in the lamplight, but she welcomed the exhaustion that helped her sleep at night without dwelling on her circumstances. The other women who worked at the shop were cordial but distant, and Delilah preferred it that way. The less they knew about her, the better. She invented details about her fictional husband when pressed, describing a kind man who had loved her dearly and died too young, and the other women clucked sympathetically and shared their own stories of loss and hardship. As August melted into September, Delilah's body began to change in ways that could no longer be attributed to generous meals. Her breasts grew tender and full. Her waist thickened despite the corset she laced as tightly as she dared, and the nausea that had plagued her mornings began to fade, replaced by an ravenous appetite that she struggled to satisfy on her limited budget. She began wearing the loosest dresses in her wardrobe, layering shawls over her shoulders even in the heat, and taking her meals in her room rather than at the communal table where Mrs. Patterson might notice her expanding middle. She let out the seams on her work dresses inch by inch, disguising the alterations with careful pressing and strategic pinning, and she walked with her shoulders back and her spine straight to minimize the evidence of her condition. It was in late September that she first encountered Kieran Holt, though she did not know his name at the time. She had been walking back to the boarding house after a particularly long day at the shop, her arms laden with fabric scraps that Madame Bouchard had allowed her to take for her own use, when a group of rowdy cowboys had come barreling down the street on horseback, whooping and hollering as they raced toward the saloon. Delilah had pressed herself against the wall of the general store to avoid being trampled, and one of the riders had pulled up short, his horse dancing nervously as he tipped his hat to her in apology. She had barely glanced at him, too focused on protecting her burden and her balance, but she had registered an impression of dark hair beneath a dusty Stetson and eyes that were surprisingly kind for a man who made his living breaking horses and herding cattle. The second time she saw him, it was in the general store where she had gone to purchase thread and buttons for her work. He had been standing at the counter, his tall frame bent slightly as he examined a saddle blanket, and when she approached to make her purchase, he had stepped aside with a courtesy that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. She had thanked him quietly and conducted her business with the shopkeeper, aware of his eyes on her as she counted out her coins. When she turned to leave, he had held the door for her, and she had nodded her acknowledgement without meeting his gaze. The third time was in early October, and this time there was no avoiding a proper introduction. Delilah had been crossing the street near the livery stable when a stray dog had darted in front of her, causing her to stumble. She had felt herself falling, her hands instinctively moving to protect her belly, when strong arms had caught her and steadied her against a solid chest. "Easy there, madam," a deep voice had said, and she had looked up into the face of the cowboy from her previous encounters. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a striking shade of gray-green, and his face, though weathered by sun and wind, was handsome in a rugged way. He was perhaps 26 or 27, she estimated, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from a man comfortable in his own skin. "Thank you," she had managed, pulling away as soon as she regained her footing. Her heart had been racing, though whether from the near fall or his proximity she could not say. "You hurt?" he had asked, his eyes scanning her face with genuine concern. "No, I am perfectly well," she had replied, smoothing down her skirts with trembling hands. "I should have been watching where I was going." "That dog's been causing trouble all week," he had said, his tone conversational. "Belongs to old Pete at the saloon, but Pete can't seem to keep him contained." She had nodded, unsure how to extricate herself from the conversation without appearing rude. He had seemed to sense her discomfort and had stepped back, giving her space. "Name's Kieran Holt," he had said, touching the brim of his hat. "I work at the Double H Ranch just south of town." "Mrs. Carson," she had replied, deliberately emphasizing her married status. "I work at Madame Bouchard's dress shop. Pleasure to meet you properly, Mrs. Carson," he had said, and there had been something in his tone that made her wonder if he had noticed the absence of genuine grief in her demeanor for a supposedly recent widow. "You take care now." She had hurried away, her cheeks flushed and her mind troubled. There had been something about the way he looked at her, as though he could see past the careful facade she had constructed, and it unnerved her. Over the following weeks, she seemed to encounter Kieran Holt with increasing frequency. He would be in the general store when she stopped for supplies, or riding past the dress shop as she swept the front steps, or eating at the restaurant next door during her brief lunch breaks. Each time, he would nod a greeting, sometimes tip his hat, but he never pushed for conversation beyond basic pleasantries. Delilah told herself she was imagining the pattern, that Albuquerque was a small town and such coincidences were inevitable, but she could not shake the feeling that he was watching her. Not in a threatening way, but with a quiet attention that made her self-conscious about every movement, every gesture that might reveal her secret. By late October, she was 4.5 months along, and despite her best efforts, her condition was becoming harder to hide. She had purchased additional fabric and constructed 2 new dresses in a style that was fashionable among the wealthier women in town, with high waists that gathered just beneath the bust and flowing skirts that disguised the gentle swell of her abdomen. She draped shawls artfully over her shoulders and carried her reticule positioned strategically in front of her when she walked. Mrs. Patterson had made a comment about her healthy appetite one evening at supper, and Delilah had forced herself to eat smaller portions in public after that, making up for it with bread and cheese consumed in the privacy of her room. Madame Bouchard had eyed her speculatively on more than one occasion, but the Frenchwoman was discreet and minded her own business, for which Delilah was grateful. It was in early November, on a cool morning when the air finally held a hint of autumn crispness, that everything changed. Delilah had been walking to work, her mind occupied with the day's tasks, when she had felt a distinct movement in her belly. It was not the first time she had felt the baby quickening, but it was the strongest yet, a rolling flutter that made her gasp and press her hand to her stomach. She had stopped in the middle of the boardwalk, overcome with a sudden rush of emotion. This was real. This was her child, alive and growing inside her, depending on her for everything. The weight of responsibility had threatened to overwhelm her, and she had stood there with tears streaming down her face, unable to move. "Mrs. Carson." The voice had startled her, and she had looked up to find Kieran Holt standing beside her, his expression concerned. He must have been coming out of the general store, she realized, noting the packages in his arms. "Are you all right?" he had asked, and the genuine worry in his tone had made her tears flow faster. "I am fine," she had lied, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Just a moment of emotion. I apologize for the display." He had shifted his packages to one arm and pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, offering it to her. "Nothing to apologize for," he had said quietly. "Everyone has rough days." She had taken the handkerchief gratefully, dabbing at her eyes and trying to compose herself. He had stood beside her in patient silence, not rushing her or demanding explanations, and somehow that kindness had made her cry harder. "I am sorry," she had said again, once she had regained some control. "I do not know what came over me." "Loss does strange things to a person," he had said, and she had looked at him sharply, wondering what he meant by that. but his expression had been open and sympathetic, with no hint of suspicion or judgment. "Yes," she had agreed softly, accepting the fiction of her widowhood. "It does. Can I walk you to the shop?" he had offered. "Make sure you get there safely." She had wanted to refuse, to maintain the distance she had carefully constructed between herself and everyone in this town, but she had found herself nodding instead. They had walked side by side through the morning streets, and he had kept up a gentle stream of conversation about neutral topics: the weather, the upcoming harvest celebration, the new foal at his ranch, anything to give her time to recover her composure. When they reached the dress shop, he had touched his hat and wished her a good day, and she had thanked him for his kindness. As she watched him walk away, she had felt something shift in her chest, a small crack in the walls she had built around her heart. After that morning, their encounters became more deliberately friendly. Kieran would stop by the dress shop under the pretense of needing a button sewn on or a tear mended, though Delilah suspected his clothing was in better repair than he claimed. He would chat with Madame Bouchard in his easy way, complimenting her accent and asking about France, and then he would turn to Delilah with that quiet smile and ask how she was managing. She found herself looking forward to his visits, though she would never have admitted it aloud. There was something solid and reassuring about his presence, and unlike the other men in town who either ignored her or looked at her with varying degrees of interest or pity, Kieran treated her like a person rather than a category. He told her about his work at the Double H Ranch, how he had come to New Mexico from Texas 5 years ago looking for a fresh start after his own parents had died in a cholera outbreak. He described the landscape he loved, the wide open spaces and the mountains in the distance, the way the sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. He talked about the horses he trained and the cattle drives he had been on, the camaraderie of the other ranch hands and the satisfaction of hard work done well. In turn, Delilah found herself sharing carefully edited pieces of her own story. She spoke of growing up in Santa Fe, of learning to sew from her mother, of her love for beautiful fabrics, and the artistry of creating something from nothing. She described her fictional husband in vague terms, painting him as a gentle man who had made her happy in their brief time together. And Kieran listened without pressing for details she could not provide. As November progressed and Delilah entered her 5th month of pregnancy, she became increasingly anxious about discovery. The baby was active now, moving frequently throughout the day and night, and she lived in constant fear that someone would notice her hand drifting to her belly or see the way her dresses pulled tight across her middle despite all her alterations. She had begun to consider leaving Albuquerque, perhaps traveling further west to California or north to Colorado, somewhere she could claim to be further along in her widowhood, and where the arrival of a baby would not invite uncomfortable questions about timing. But the thought of leaving exhausted her, and she had no guarantee that another town would be any more welcoming, or that she could find work as easily as she had here. It was in the 3rd week of November when Kieran finally acknowledged what he had clearly known for some time. Delilah had been leaving the dress shop late in the evening, her arms full of a finished gown that needed to be delivered to a customer the next morning. The street was dark except for the light spilling from the saloon down the block, and she had not seen Kieran waiting near his horse until she nearly walked into him. "Mr. Holt," she had gasped, startled. "I did not see you there." "Sorry to frighten you," he had said, moving to help her with the unwieldy gown. "I was hoping to catch you before you headed home, thought you might like some company for the walk." "That is kind of you, but unnecessary," she had replied, though in truth the dark streets made her nervous and she was grateful for his presence. They had walked in silence for a few moments before he spoke again, his voice low and careful. "Mrs. Carson, I hope you will not take offense at what I am about to say, but I want you to know that if you need help of any kind, I am willing to provide it." Her heart had stuttered in her chest, and she had gripped the gown tighter. "I do not know what you mean." "I think you do," he had said gently. "And I want you to know that I am not judging you, and I am not going to spread gossip or make your life difficult. I just want you to know that you do not have to carry your burdens alone." She had stopped walking, turning to face him in the dim light. "Mr. Holt, I really do not, the dresses," he had interrupted softly. "They are getting looser each week, but you are not. The way you hold yourself, always so careful, always protecting. The way you stopped taking meals at the boarding house. I notice things, Mrs. Carson, and I have been noticing you." Delilah had felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Tears had sprung to her eyes, and she had opened her mouth to deny everything, to maintain the fiction that had kept her safe. But the words would not come. "There is no Mr. Carson, is there?" Kieran had asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "At least, not one who died in a mining accident." She had shaken her head mutely, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "And you are trying to hide the fact that you are carrying a child, probably 5 months along if I am guessing right, and you came to Albuquerque to start over where nobody knows your story." "Please," she had whispered, her voice breaking. "Please do not tell anyone. I will leave town if you want, I will go somewhere else, but please do not tell. I cannot lose this baby. I cannot." Hey, he had said, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders gently. "I am not going to tell anyone anything. That is not why I said something." "Then why?" she had demanded, searching his face for some hint of his intentions. "Because you looked like you were about to collapse from the weight of carrying this secret alone," he had said simply. "And because I think you are one of the bravest women I have ever met, trying to make a life for yourself and your child in circumstances that would break most people. And because I want to help if you will let me." "Why would you help me?" she had asked, bewildered. "You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." "No, I do not," he had agreed. "But I know what it is like to be alone in the world with nobody to turn to, and I would not wish that on anyone, especially not someone in your situation." They had stood there in the darkened street, the gown clutched between them, and Delilah had felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. She had been so convinced that everyone would judge her, condemn her, turn away from her in disgust, that she had not allowed herself to consider that someone might offer genuine help without strings attached. "I do not understand," she had said finally. "What kind of help are you offering?" "Whatever kind you need," he had replied. "If you need money, I can share what I have saved. If you need someone to vouch for your character, I am happy to do that. If you need a friend who knows the truth and will not judge you for it, I can be that too. I am not asking for anything in return, Mrs. Carson. I am just offering to help because it is the right thing to do." She had searched his face for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but all she had seen was sincerity and a kindness that made her chest ache. "You said I already know," she had whispered, remembering his earlier words. "You said you already know about the baby." "I do," he had confirmed. "Have known for a few weeks now, truth be told. I was just waiting for the right time to say something and for you to trust me enough to hear it. And you truly do not think less of me?" she had asked, her voice small and uncertain. "I think you are doing the best you can in a difficult situation," he had said firmly. "And I think the man who left you to face this alone is a coward who does not deserve you." Those words had broken something open inside her, and she had found herself sobbing in earnest, all the fear and loneliness and desperation of the past months pouring out in great gasping waves. Kieran had taken the gown from her arms and set it carefully aside, then pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home. He had held her while she cried, one hand rubbing slow circles on her back, murmuring reassurances that everything would be all right, that she was strong enough to face whatever came, that she was not alone anymore. And standing there in his arms, feeling the solid strength of him and the genuine compassion in his touch, Delilah had allowed herself to believe it might be true. When her tears had finally subsided, he had walked her back to the boarding house, carrying the gown and keeping up a steady stream of gentle conversation to help her regain her composure. At the door, he had handed over the dress and tipped his hat, reminding her that his offer of help stood whenever she needed it. That night, lying in bed with her hands pressed to her belly, Delilah had replayed every moment of their conversation. She had been so certain that discovery meant disaster, but instead, she felt lighter than she had in months. Someone knew her secret and had not turned away. Someone had looked at her situation and offered help without judgment. And that someone was Kieran Holt, a cowboy with kind eyes and a gentle heart who had somehow seen past her defenses to the frightened woman beneath. Over the following days, their friendship deepened in ways that surprised her. Kieran began stopping by the dress shop more frequently, often bringing small gifts that he claimed were extras from the ranch. Fresh eggs, he would say, because the chickens were laying more than the cook could use. Venison, because one of the ranch hands had been hunting and brought back more meat than they needed. Apples from a tree on the property that was producing prolifically this year. Delilah knew he was making excuses to ensure she was eating well, and though part of her wanted to refuse out of pride, the practical part of her that worried about affording enough food for herself and the baby accepted with gratitude. She would invite him to sit while she worked, and they would talk about everything and nothing, building a foundation of friendship that felt both comfortable and thrilling. Madame Bouchard watched these interactions with shrewd eyes but said nothing, and Delilah suspected the Frenchwoman approved of Kieran's attention. The other women who worked at the shop began to tease her gently about her gentleman caller, and she would blush and insist they were merely friends, which was true, even if her heart sometimes whispered that it wanted more. As December arrived and brought cooler temperatures to Albuquerque, Delilah found it increasingly difficult to hide her condition. She was nearly 6 months along now, and her belly had rounded considerably, despite her best efforts to disguise it. She had stopped attending church services because the close quarters made her nervous, and she took her meals exclusively in her room, claiming a delicate stomach that could not tolerate the boarding house cooking. Mrs. Patterson had grown suspicious, making comments about Delilah's weight gain and asking pointed questions about when she might be receiving visitors or making trips to see family. Delilah deflected as best she could, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the landlady figured out the truth. It was Kieran who suggested a solution that had not occurred to her. They had been sitting in the back room of the dress shop on a quiet afternoon, and she had been confiding her fears about what would happen when her pregnancy became undeniable, when he had leaned forward and taken her hand. "Marry me," he had said simply. She had stared at him in shock, certain she had misheard. "What, marry me?" he had repeated. "We can say we have been courting quietly since you arrived in Albuquerque and that you have finished your period of mourning for your late husband. We can get married before Christmas, and then when the baby comes in the spring, everyone will assume it is early or that we anticipated our vows. Either way, the child will have a name and you will have respectability." "Kieran, I cannot ask you to do that," she had protested, even as her heart had leaped at the possibility. "That would be too much. You would be taking on responsibility for a child that is not yours, binding yourself to a woman you barely know, all to save me from scandal. You are not asking. I am offering, he had corrected. And I know you well enough to know that I respect you, enjoy your company, and want to help you. As for the child, every baby deserves a father, and I would be honored to be that for yours if you will let me. But what about love? She had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Should marriage not be based on more than just practical considerations? He had been quiet for a moment, his thumb rubbing gentle circles over her knuckles. I would be lying if I said I did not care for you, Delilah. I have cared for you since that first day when you nearly fell and I caught you. I have spent the past 2 months finding excuses to be near you, learning everything I can about you, falling a little more every time you smile or share a piece of yourself with me. Her breath had caught at the admission, and she had searched his face with wonder. You care for me, more than care, he had admitted, his gray-green eyes intense. I am falling in love with you if you want the truth of it. I love your strength and your determination. I love the way you bite your lip when you are concentrating on a difficult scene. I love how you talk to your unborn child when you think nobody is listening, promising to give them the best life you can. I love that you chose to keep your baby even when it would have been easier to give them up. I love everything about you, and if you will have me, I would count myself the luckiest man in New Mexico. Delilah had felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. I do not deserve you, she had whispered. You deserve someone who will stand by you and love you and give you the life you should have had all along, he had countered. And I want to be that person if you will let me. So what do you say, Delilah Carson? Will you marry me? She had looked at this man who had somehow become essential to her happiness in such a short time, this cowboy with the gentle hands and the generous heart, and she had known that her answer could only be yes. Yes, she had said, her voice trembling with emotion. Yes, I will marry you. He had pulled her into his arms then, holding her carefully, mindful of her belly, and she had rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. I will do everything I can to make you happy, he had promised. I swear it. You already do, she had replied, and meant it with her whole heart. They had married 10 days later in a simple ceremony at the small Catholic church on the edge of town. Delilah had worn a dress she made herself, pale blue silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, cut in the fashionable high-waisted style that accommodated her changing figure. Madame Bouchard had served as her witness, and one of Kieran's friends from the ranch had stood up for him. The priest had been a kind-faced man who asked no uncomfortable questions about the timeline of their courtship, merely blessing their union and wishing them happiness. Kieran had slid a simple gold band onto her finger, and when the priest had pronounced them husband and wife, he had kissed her with such tenderness that she had felt cherished in a way she had never experienced before. They had celebrated with a dinner at the hotel restaurant, just the 4 of them, and Madame Bouchard had toasted their happiness in rapid French that made Kieran laugh, even though he did not understand the words. His ranch friend, a jovial man named Pete, had clapped Kieran on the back and told Delilah she was getting a good man, one of the best he knew. That evening, Kieran had brought Delilah to the small house he rented on the outskirts of town, a modest structure with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room that felt palatial compared to her cramped boarding house quarters. He had carried her over the threshold despite her protests that she was too heavy, and he had set her down gently in the middle of the sitting room and told her that this was her home now, to arrange and decorate however she pleased. She had walked through the rooms in wonder, taking in the sturdy furniture and clean floors, the curtains at the windows and the stone fireplace that would keep them warm through the winter. In the second bedroom, Kieran had already set up a cradle hand-carved from pine, and when she had seen it, she had burst into tears yet again. "I made it myself," he had said, looking suddenly shy. "I know I am not much of a carpenter, but I wanted the baby to have something special." "It is perfect," she had choked out, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Everything is perfect. I cannot believe this is real." He had wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands coming to rest on her belly, and she had leaned back against him, feeling safe and loved in a way she had never thought possible. "This is real," he had murmured against her hair. "You are my wife, and that baby is going to be my child, and we are going to be a family. I promise you that." That night, they had lain together in his bed, now their bed, and he had held her carefully, stroking her hair and telling her stories about his childhood in Texas, until she had drifted off to sleep. He had been patient and gentle, not pushing for more than she was ready to give, and she had fallen asleep feeling protected and valued in ways that Thomas Whitmore had never made her feel. The next morning, she had woken to the smell of coffee and bacon, and had found Kieran in the kitchen making breakfast. He had been cheerful and attentive, asking how she had slept and whether the baby had kept her awake with movement. She had found herself laughing as she described the sensation of tiny feet kicking her ribs, and he had asked if he could feel. She had taken his hand and placed it on her belly, and they had waited together until the baby obliged with a solid kick that made Kieran's face light up with wonder. "That is incredible," he had breathed. "There is really a person in there." "There really is," she had agreed, feeling a surge of love for this man who was so genuinely excited about a child that was not biologically his. As December progressed toward Christmas, Delilah settled into married life with a sense of contentment she had not known was possible. Kieran continued to work at the Double H Ranch, rising early to tend to the horses and cattle, while she maintained her position at the dress shop, though she had reduced her hours with Madame Bouchard's blessing. Word spread quickly through Albuquerque that the widowed Mrs. Carson had remarried, and while there was some gossip about the speed of the courtship, most people seemed genuinely happy for them. Mrs. Patterson made pointed comments about propriety, but even she could not deny that Kieran Holt was a respectable man with steady employment and good character. Delilah found herself looking forward to Kieran's return each evening, to the way his face would light up when he saw her, to the gentle kiss he would press to her forehead before asking about her day. They would share meals at the small kitchen table, talking about everything from the ranch gossip to Delilah's customers at the dress shop to their plans for the baby. Kieran insisted on doing the heavier chores around the house, refusing to let Delilah lift anything he deemed too strenuous for her condition. He chopped firewood and hauled water and tended to the small vegetable garden behind the house with cheerful determination. In the evenings, he would rub her swollen feet and read aloud from the newspaper while she did hand sewing, creating tiny gowns and blankets for the baby. Christmas arrived with unseasonably mild weather, and Kieran surprised Delilah with gifts he had been secretly acquiring. A warm shawl in deep green wool, a set of hairpins decorated with tiny flowers, and a leather-bound journal for recording her thoughts and the baby's milestones. She had made him a new shirt from fabric Madame Bouchard had sold her at cost, embroidering his initials on the cuff in fine black thread. They attended Christmas Mass together, and Delilah felt a profound sense of gratitude as she prayed. 6 months ago, she had been alone and terrified, facing an uncertain future with nothing but her own determination to sustain her. Now she had a husband who loved her, a home that felt safe, and hope for a future that looked bright. As the new year of 1879 began, Delilah entered the final trimester of her pregnancy, She had stopped working at the dress shop entirely, both because her size made it difficult to sit at the sewing machine for long periods, and because Kieran insisted she needed to rest and prepare for the baby's arrival. She spent her days making final preparations, washing and folding the tiny clothes she had sewn, organizing the nursery, and reading every book about childbirth and infant care she could get her hands on. Kieran's mother had died when he was young, but he still had her recipe box, and Delilah spent hours copying out the recipes, imagining the meals she would prepare for their growing family. The baby was very active now, and Delilah often found herself sitting with her hands on her belly, marveling at the rolls and kicks that seemed to intensify in the evenings. Kieran would join her after supper, his ear pressed to her stomach, listening for the heartbeat and talking to the baby about the horses at the ranch and the life they would have together. "What if I do not know how to be a mother?" Delilah had asked one evening, voicing a fear that had been growing as her due date approached. "What if I am terrible at it?" "You are going to be wonderful," Kieran had assured her, kissing her rounded belly. "You already love this baby so much, and that is what matters most. The rest we will figure out together." "And what if the baby does not like you?" she had worried. "What if they can somehow sense that you are not their biological father? Then I will love them even more until they realize I am their father in every way that counts," he had said firmly. "Biology does not make a father, Delilah. Love and commitment and showing up every day, that is what makes a father. And I am going to be there for every moment, I promise you that." His words had soothed her anxious heart, and she had pulled him close, kissing him with all the love she felt, but still struggled to express in words. Their relationship had grown from friendship to partnership to something deeper and more profound, and she found herself falling more in love with him every day. In early March, when Delilah was 8 months along, Kieran brought home news that made her heart sink. The Double H Ranch was planning a cattle drive to Colorado in late March, a journey that would take several weeks and require all hands on deck. Kieran would be expected to go, and while the pay would be excellent, it meant leaving Delilah alone right around her due date. "I will tell them I cannot go," Kieran had said immediately when he saw her face. "The boss will understand. Family comes first." "No," Delilah had protested, even though the thought of going through childbirth without him terrified her. "You need that money. We need that money for the baby." "We will manage without it," he had insisted. "I am not leaving you to face this alone." They had argued about it for days, Delilah insisting he should go and Kieran adamantly refusing. Finally, they had reached a compromise. Kieran would speak to his boss about doing only the first week of the drive, helping get the cattle started and then riding back to Albuquerque before Delilah's due date. It would mean less money, but he would be home when she needed him most. The plan had seemed sound until early April, when Delilah woke in the pre-dawn hours with a sharp pain radiating across her belly. She had lain still for a moment, wondering if it was just the baby shifting position, but then another pain came, stronger this time, and she had realized with a jolt of fear that labor was beginning. Kieran had left with the cattle drive 3 days earlier, planning to turn back the following week. But the baby, it seemed, had other ideas about timing. Delilah had managed to dress herself and make her way to the neighbor's house, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, who had offered to help when the time came. Mrs. Chen had taken one look at Delilah's face and had sent her husband to fetch the midwife, then had settled Delilah in her own bedroom and begun heating water and gathering clean linens. The midwife, a capable woman named Sarah who had delivered half the babies in Albuquerque, had examined Delilah and announced that it would be a while yet. First babies always took their time. She had encouraged Delilah to walk around, to eat light foods, to rest when she could between the pains that were growing stronger and closer together. By mid-afternoon, Delilah had been in hard labor, the pains coming so frequently that she could barely catch her breath between them. She had gripped Mrs. Chen's hand and tried to remember everything she had read about breathing and pushing, but nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming intensity of bringing a child into the world. "I want Kieran," she had gasped between contractions. "I need him here." "I know, honey, Mrs. Chen had soothed, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "But you are doing so well. Just a little longer now." As the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Delilah had heard the midwife say it was time to push. She had borne down with all her strength, every muscle in her body straining, and had felt the baby moving through her, closer and closer to being born. And then, just as she had been certain she could not endure another moment, she had heard the front door burst open and Kieran's voice calling her name. He had appeared in the doorway, dusty from hard riding, his face frantic with worry. "I am here," he had said, rushing to her side and taking her hand. "I am here, love. I got a feeling something was wrong and I rode back as hard as I could." "The baby is coming," she had panted, gripping his hand with desperate strength. "I know," he had said, his voice steady and calm despite the fear in his eyes. "And you are doing amazing. I am so proud of you." With Kieran there holding her hand and murmuring encouragement, Delilah had found a reserve of strength she did not know she possessed. She had pushed when the midwife told her to push, breathed when she was told to breathe, and finally, as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, she had felt the baby slide free from her body. The first cry had been the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, a lusty wail that announced to the world that this child was alive and healthy and ready to take on life. The midwife had cleaned the baby quickly and wrapped them in a blanket, then had placed the tiny bundle in Delilah's arms. "A boy," Sarah had announced with a smile. "A fine, healthy boy." Delilah had looked down at her son, taking in his scrunched-up face and the dark hair plastered to his head, and had felt her heart expand with more love than she had thought possible. "Hello," she had whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, little one, I am your mama." Kieran had leaned over her shoulder, his own eyes wet as he gazed at the baby. "He is perfect," he had breathed. "Absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold him?" Delilah had asked, and when Kieran had nodded, she had carefully transferred the baby to his arms. She had watched as Kieran had cradled their son with infinite gentleness, his rough cowboy hands so careful with the tiny fragile life. "Hey there, little man," he had murmured. "I am your papa. And I am going to love you and protect you for the rest of my life." The baby had seemed to settle at the sound of Kieran's voice, his crying quieting to small whimpers, and Delilah had known with absolute certainty that this child would never doubt who his father was. They had named him Daniel, after Kieran's father, with the middle name Thomas, which Delilah had insisted on despite Kieran's protest that they did not need to honor the man who had abandoned her. But Delilah had been firm that regardless of Thomas Whitmore's failures, he had given her this precious child, and that deserved acknowledgement, even if it was only in a middle name that would rarely be used. The days following Daniel's birth had been a blur of feedings and diaper changes and overwhelming exhaustion. Delilah had been sore and tired, her body recovering from the trauma of childbirth, but every time she looked at her son, she had felt such joy that the discomfort seemed insignificant. Kieran had been an attentive and loving father from the very beginning. He had changed diapers and walked the floor with Daniel when he cried, had learned to swaddle him tightly and rock him just right to help him sleep. He had brought Delilah meals in bed, and insisted she rest while he handled the household chores. And he had looked at their son with such open adoration that Delilah had fallen even more deeply in love with her husband. As the weeks passed, and Delilah regained her strength, they had settled into a rhythm as a family. Kieran had returned to work at the Double H Ranch, though he had arranged for shorter days so he could be home to help with Daniel. Delilah had found herself content to focus on motherhood for now, setting aside her sewing work to devote herself to caring for her son. Daniel proved to be a good baby, sleeping for reasonable stretches at night and nursing well. He had Delilah's dark eyes and a head full of dark hair that stuck up in all directions no matter how often she tried to smooth it down. Kieran swore the baby had her smile, though Delilah argued that newborns did not really smile, just grimaced from gas. By the time Daniel was 2 months old, in early June of 1879, Delilah felt ready to venture out into society again. She had accepted invitations to church and had attended a few social gatherings with Kieran, showing off their son to the women of Albuquerque who cooed over him and offered advice on everything from colic remedies to teething. There was some quiet speculation about Daniel's paternity, given the timeline of Delilah's arrival in Albuquerque and her marriage to Kieran, but most people were too polite to voice their suspicions aloud. And even if they had, Delilah no longer cared. She had a husband who loved her, a healthy son, and a future that looked bright. What did it matter what people whispered behind their hands? One warm evening in late June, after putting Daniel down for the night, Delilah and Kieran had sat together on the porch of their little house, watching the sun set over the desert. Kieran had his arm around her shoulders, and she had leaned against him, feeling peaceful and content. "Do you ever regret it?" she had asked quietly. "Marrying me, taking on Daniel, giving up your freedom?" "Not for a single second," he had replied firmly. "You and Daniel are the best things that ever happened to me. I wake up every morning grateful that you said yes when I asked you to marry me." "I am grateful too," she had said, tilting her face up to look at him. "I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that you came into my life. We deserve each other," he had said, kissing her softly, "and we deserve this life we are building together. I love you, Delilah. I am so completely and utterly in love with you." "I love you too," she had whispered, and had meant it with her entire heart. As the summer progressed, their love continued to deepen. Kieran showed her in 1,000 small ways how much he cherished her. From bringing her wildflowers he picked on the range to taking overnight feedings when she was exhausted to simply holding her and telling her she was beautiful even when she felt anything but. Delilah had begun to let go of the guilt and shame she had carried for so long about the circumstances of Daniel's conception. She had made a mistake in trusting Thomas Whitmore, yes, but that mistake had brought her Daniel, and Daniel had brought her Kieran, and she could not regret a path that had led her to such happiness. In August, when Daniel was 4 months old, Kieran had come home from the ranch with unexpected news. The owner of the Double H Ranch was selling the property and retiring to California, and he had offered Kieran the opportunity to purchase a small parcel of land that bordered the main ranch, along with 20 head of cattle and 2 horses, at a price Kieran could afford with his savings and a loan from the bank. "It would be our own place," Kieran had explained, his eyes bright with excitement. "Not a ranch exactly, not yet, but the start of one. We could build a bigger house, raise cattle and horses, maybe grow some crops, build something for Daniel, something to pass down to him when he is grown." Delilah had not hesitated. "Yes," she had said immediately. "Yes, let us do it." They had spent the fall preparing for the move, with Kieran working longer hours to save extra money and Delilah sewing clothes and linens for their new home. In November, they had moved to their land, living in a small cabin that had been used by ranch hands until Kieran could build them a proper house. The cabin was cramped with the three of them, especially as Daniel grew more active and began trying to crawl, but Delilah had never been happier. She loved waking up to the sight of the mountains in the distance, loved watching Kieran work the land he now owned, loved the sense of possibility that came with building something from nothing. By the spring of 1880, when Daniel was a year old and taking his first wobbly steps, Kieran had completed the frame of their new house. It was not large or fancy, but it had 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a sitting room with windows that faced the sunset. Delilah had helped with the interior work, painting walls and sewing curtains, and by June they had moved into their completed home. They had held a small celebration to mark the occasion, inviting Madame Bouchard and a few friends from town. Delilah had cooked for days, preparing dishes from Kieran's mother's recipe box, and they had eaten and laughed and danced in their new sitting room while Daniel had clapped his hands and babbled happily. That night, after their guests had departed and Daniel was asleep in his new room, Kieran had carried Delilah to their bedroom, the first truly private space they had had since marrying. He had made love to her with tenderness and passion, and afterward, as they lay tangled together, he had whispered that he wanted to give her more children if she was willing. "I would like that," she had replied, her hand trailing over his chest. "I would like a house full of children with you." "How many is a house full?" he had teased, and she had laughed. "Let us start with one more and see how we manage," she had suggested, and he had agreed. In February of 1881, Delilah had discovered she was pregnant again. Unlike her pregnancy with Daniel, this one was joyful from the start, shared openly with Kieran, who was over the moon with excitement. He had been attentive during her first pregnancy once he knew about it, but this time he was even more devoted, insisting she rest frequently and bringing her strange food combinations she craved at odd hours. Their daughter had been born in October of 1881, a tiny thing with wisps of blonde hair and Kieran's gray-green eyes. They had named her Clara, after Delilah's grandmother, and Kieran had held her with the same gentle reverence he had shown Daniel, promising to protect her and love her always. Daniel, now 2.5, had been fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to touch her soft hair and hold her tiny hands. Delilah had watched her children together and had felt her heart might burst from happiness. The years that followed had been full of hard work and simple joys. The ranch had grown slowly but steadily, with Kieran acquiring more cattle and horses, and Delilah had taken in sewing work from home when she could spare the time between caring for the children and managing the household. In 1883, they had welcomed another son, Michael, who had his father's dark hair and his mother's smile. In 1885, twin girls had arrived unexpectedly, Emma and Grace, completing their family of 7. The house that had seemed so spacious when they built it had become wonderfully chaotic, filled with children's laughter and the noise of daily life. Delilah had sometimes looked around at the muddy boots by the door, and the toys scattered across the floor, and the laundry that never seemed to end, and had marveled at how far she had come from that terrified young woman who had arrived in Albuquerque with nothing but secrets and shame. Kieran had proven to be everything he had promised, and more. He was a devoted father who spent his evenings playing with the children and teaching them about the land and the animals. He was a loving husband who still brought Delilah wildflowers and told her she was beautiful even after 5 children had changed her body. He was a hard worker who built their ranch into something profitable and sustainable, providing security for their growing family. And most importantly, He had never once treated Daniel differently from their other children. He loved all 5 of them fiercely and equally. And if anyone in Albuquerque remembered or cared that Daniel had been born perhaps a bit early by conventional counting, they kept their opinions to themselves. One evening in the summer of 1888, when Daniel was 9 and already showing signs of the man he would become, Delilah had found Kieran sitting on the porch after the children were in bed, staring out at the land they had built together. "What are you thinking about?" she had asked, settling beside him. "Just how lucky I am," he had replied, pulling her close. 10 years ago, I was a cowboy with nothing but a horse and a job. Now I have you, 5 incredible children, a ranch of my own, and more happiness than I ever dreamed possible." "I am the lucky one," she had countered. "You saved me, Kieran. You and your kindness and your willingness to see past my mistakes to the person I was trying to be." "We saved each other," he had said, kissing her temple. "You gave me a family and a purpose. You made me a better man." They had sat in comfortable silence for a while before Delilah had voiced something that had been on her mind. "Daniel asked me yesterday about his father," she had said quietly. "His birth father." Kieran had tensed slightly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth," she had replied. "That his birth father was a man I knew before I came to Albuquerque. A man who was not ready to be a father and who left before Daniel was born. And then I told him that you are his real father, the one who chose him and loves him and has been there for every important moment of his life." "How did he take it?" Kieran had asked. He thought about it for a minute, and then he asked if that meant you loved him even though you did not have to, and I said yes, that is exactly what it means. And then he said that made you the best papa in the world, and he went back to playing with his toy horses. Kieran had blinked rapidly, his eyes suspiciously bright. "That boy has no idea how much I love him." "I think he does," Delilah had said softly. "I think all our children know how loved they are, and that is the greatest gift we could ever give them." As the years continued to pass, the Holt family had become a fixture in the Albuquerque community. Kieran served on the town council and helped organize the annual harvest celebration. Delilah had joined the church ladies' auxiliary and had taught sewing classes to young women who wanted to learn the trade. Their children had grown and thrived. Daniel had become his father's right hand on the ranch, showing a natural aptitude for working with horses. Clara had inherited her mother's skill with needle and thread and had talked about opening her own dress shop someday. Michael was the adventurous one, always exploring and asking questions about everything. The twins, Emma and Grace, were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into mischief together. In 1895, when Daniel was 16, a stranger had come to the ranch asking questions. He had introduced himself as Thomas Whitmore, and Delilah's blood had run cold when she heard the name. Kieran had been in the barn when Thomas had arrived, and Delilah had been alone in the kitchen when she had looked up to see the man who had ruined and then saved her life standing in her doorway. "Delilah," Thomas had said, and she had noticed he looked older, softer, with lines around his eyes and gray in his hair. "I know I have no right to be here, but I had to come." "You should leave," she had said, her voice cold. "You have no business here." "I know," he had agreed. "But I had to see if the rumors were true. I heard you married and had children, and I wanted to see if one of them was mine." "None of them are yours," she had said flatly. "They are all Kieran Holt's children. He is their father in every way that matters." "Delilah, please," Thomas had said, taking a step forward. "I made a terrible mistake all those years ago. I was young and scared, and I ran when I should have stayed. I have regretted it every day since." "I do not care about your regrets," she had said, standing her ground. "You made your choice, and I made mine. I have built a good life here with a good man, and I will not let you disrupt that. I am not trying to disrupt anything, he had protested. I just want to meet my son to tell him I am sorry. He is not your son, Delilah had repeated firmly. And even if he were biologically related to you, you gave up any right to call him that when you abandoned us. Now please leave before my husband gets back from the barn, because I do not think he will be as civil as I am being. Thomas had looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Delilah's expression must have convinced him she was serious. If he ever wants to know about me, about his heritage, will you at least tell him I came looking? He had asked. I will tell him you came and that I sent you away because we do not need you, she had replied. Now go. He had left without further argument, and Delilah had stood in her kitchen shaking with anger and old hurt until Kieran had come in from the barn and found her. She had told him everything, and he had held her while she cried, not for Thomas or what might have been, but for the girl she had been who had suffered so much alone. That evening they had sat Daniel down and told him about Thomas's visit. Their son had listened quietly, his young face serious, and when they finished, he had asked only one question. You want me to have a relationship with him? He had asked, looking between his parents. That is entirely your decision, Kieran had said. He is your biological father, and if you want to know him, we will not stand in your way. But you should know that regardless of biology, you are my son, and nothing will ever change that. Daniel had thought about it for a long moment before shaking his head. He had 16 years to be my father, and he never tried until now. Papa, you are the one who taught me to ride and helped me with my schoolwork and was there for every important moment of my life. I do not need another father. I already have the best one. Kieran had pulled Daniel into a fierce embrace, and Delilah had watched her husband and son together, and had known that the choice she made all those years ago to keep her baby and come to Albuquerque had been the right one, regardless of how hard the journey had been. The years continued their steady march forward. The children grew into young adults, finding their own paths in life. Daniel married a local girl named Sarah and started his own ranch adjacent to his parents' land. Clara opened her dress shop in Albuquerque and became known for her exquisite work. Michael went east to study engineering, sending long letters home about his adventures. The twins married brothers from a neighboring ranch and settled close enough to visit regularly. Through it all, Delilah and Kieran's love remained strong and steady. They grew older together, their hair graying and their faces lining, but the way they looked at each other never changed. They were partners and lovers and best friends, bound together by years of shared joys and sorrows, by the family they had built, and the life they had created from nothing but determination and hope. In 1910, when they were both in their 50s and had been married for over 30 years, Kieran had brought Delilah out to the porch where they had spent so many evenings watching the sunset. The ranch had expanded considerably over the decades, and they now employed several ranch hands to help with the work. Their children had given them 14 grandchildren, with more on the way, and the little house they had built had been added onto multiple times to accommodate family gatherings. Do you remember the day we met? Kieran had asked, settling onto the porch swing beside her. Which time? She had teased. The first time I barely noticed you because I was trying not to get trampled by cowboys. The second time in the general store when I was too nervous to look at you properly. Or the third time when you caught me before I fell. The third time, he had said with a smile. When I held you in my arms and knew I was going to marry you someday. You did not know that, she had protested, though she was smiling too. I absolutely did, he had insisted. I looked at you and thought, there is the woman I am going to spend my life with, and I was right. You were right, she had agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "About so many things. You were right that I was brave enough to face whatever came. You were right that we would figure out parenthood together. You were right that love and commitment matter more than biology. You have been right about everything that matters." "Not everything," he had said modestly, "but I was definitely right about you. Loving you has been the best decision of my life." "And loving you has been mine," she had replied, tilting her face up for a kiss. They had sat together as the sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, the same colors they had watched thousands of times over the years, and Delilah had reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From scared and alone in Santa Fe to loved and cherished in Albuquerque, from hiding her growing belly under loose dresses to proudly showing off her grandchildren, from believing herself ruined to knowing herself blessed. And it had all started with a cowboy who noticed what she was hiding and said he already knew, who offered help without judgment and love without conditions, who became her husband and her partner and the father of her children not through biology but through choice. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Kieran had squeezed her hand and said, "Ready to go inside?" "In a minute," she had replied, wanting to hold onto this perfect moment just a little longer. "Let us watch the stars come out first." So they had sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life more beautiful than either had dared to imagine, watching as the first stars appeared in the vast New Mexico sky, each one a tiny light in the darkness, much like the hope that had sustained them through all the years and all the challenges, burning steady and true. Their story had not been easy, and it had not followed any conventional path, but it had been theirs, written in moments of courage and kindness, in choices made for love rather than convenience, in a willingness to see past surface appearances to the truth beneath. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family, their children and grandchildren who had come for Sunday dinner and lingered into the evening. Laughter echoed from the kitchen where their daughters were cleaning up, and the deeper rumble of their sons' voices came from the sitting room where they were discussing ranch business. Children's giggles floated out from the bedrooms where the grandchildren were supposed to be settling down for the night. It was chaos and noise and mess, and absolutely perfect. "Now are you ready?" Kieran had asked again, standing and offering her his hand. "Now I am ready," Delilah had agreed, taking his hand and letting him pull her to her feet. They had walked into their house together, into the warm light and the sound of family, into the life they had built one choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment of courage and kindness at a time. And as Delilah looked around at her children and grandchildren, at the home she and Kieran had created, at the evidence of a life well lived and love well given, she knew that every struggle had been worth it. Every tear had watered the seeds of the happiness she now enjoyed, and every moment of fear and doubt had been transformed into strength and certainty. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in Albuquerque hiding secrets and shame. She was Delilah Holt, wife and mother and grandmother, rancher and seamstress and pillar of the community, a woman who had faced adversity and emerged stronger, who had been knocked down and gotten back up, who had lost herself and found herself again in the love of a good man and the family they had created together. And she was happy, truly, deeply, completely happy. As they settled into bed that night, Kieran had pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in the familiar embrace she had known for over 3 decades. "I love you," he had murmured against her hair, the same words he said every night and would continue to say for all the nights to come. "I love you too," she had replied, the same response she gave every time, meaning it more with each passing year. Outside, the wind whispered across the desert, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust and the promise of another beautiful New Mexico morning. Inside, the Holt family slept peacefully, safe and loved and together. And in the master bedroom, Delilah and Kieran held each other close, two hearts beating as one, two lives intertwined so completely that it was impossible to imagine one without the other, two souls who had found their home not in a place but in each other. The story that had begun with a secret and a loose dress, with fear and desperation and the determination to build a better life, had become a love story for the ages. Not because it was easy or perfect or followed any conventional path, but because it was real and hard-won, and built on a foundation of genuine love and respect and partnership. Kieran had seen what Delilah was hiding and had said he already knew, but what he had really seen was not just her pregnancy but her strength, her courage, her worthiness of love and support. And in seeing her truly, in offering help without judgment and love without conditions, he had given her the greatest gift possible, the chance to become who she was always meant to be. And Delilah, in accepting his help and his love, in choosing to trust him with her truth and her heart, had given him the family and purpose he had always longed for, transforming them both from solitary individuals into partners in the truest sense. Their children would tell their story to their own children someday, of how Grandma Delilah came to Albuquerque alone and afraid, and how Grandpa Kieran noticed what she was hiding and offered his help and his heart. They would tell it as a love story, which it was, but also as a story of courage and kindness, of second chances and new beginnings, of the power of choosing love over fear, compassion over judgment, hope over despair. And those grandchildren would grow up knowing that they came from strong stock, from people who faced impossible odds and created beautiful lives anyway, from love that was chosen rather than forced, earned rather than assumed, deepened through years of partnership and commitment, and the daily choice to show up for each other no matter what challenges arose. The years would continue to pass, as years do, bringing new joys and new sorrows, new challenges and new triumphs. The ranch would be passed down to Daniel and eventually to his children. The dress shop would thrive under Clara's management, and eventually be taken over by one of the twins' daughters who showed aptitude for the work. Michael would return from the East with an engineering degree and help bring modern innovations to Albuquerque, making the town proud. And through it all, Delilah and Kieran would remain the center of the family, the roots from which all the branches grew, the example of what love should look like that their children and grandchildren would try to emulate in their own relationships. When Kieran passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1925 at the age of 73, with Delilah holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed, his last words were, "Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. You made my life complete." And when Delilah followed him just 3 months later, unable or unwilling to live long without her partner of 46 years, her last words were, "I am coming, my love. Wait for me." They were buried side by side in the Albuquerque cemetery, their headstone reading simply, Kieran Holt, beloved husband and father, and Delilah Holt, beloved wife and mother. But those simple words contained volumes of meaning, representing decades of love and partnership, of family built and legacy created, of two lives that had intersected at exactly the right moment and had been forever transformed by the connection. Their story became part of the fabric of Albuquerque history, told and retold over the years, changing slightly with each telling but always maintaining the essential truth. That love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. That kindness costs nothing but means everything. That family is built not just through blood but through choice and commitment. and that sometimes the best things in life come from the most difficult beginnings. The ranch they built still operates today, now run by their great-great-grandchildren who take pride in maintaining the legacy their ancestors created. Visitors to the ranch can still see the spot where Kieran proposed, where he offered to marry Delilah and give her child his name, where two people made a choice that would echo through generations. They can walk through the rooms where 5 children grew up loved and secure, where family dinners were shared and memories were made, where laughter and tears and all the messy, beautiful reality of life unfolded day by day. And if you visit on a quiet evening, when the sun is setting and painting the sky in those familiar shades of orange and pink and purple, you can almost feel their presence. 2 souls who loved so deeply and built so well that their legacy continues long after they departed this world. The story of Delilah and Kieran Holt reminds us that our worst moments do not have to define us, that shame can be transformed into strength, that fear can give way to courage, and that love, when offered freely and accepted gratefully, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds and build even the strongest foundations. It reminds us that sometimes the help we need comes from unexpected sources, that judgment is not inevitable, that second chances exist for those brave enough to reach for them, and that the family we create through choice can be just as powerful and meaningful as the family we are born into. And most importantly, it reminds us that every person has a story, that behind every brave face there might be hidden struggles, that kindness costs nothing but can change everything, and that the simple act of seeing someone truly, of acknowledging their truth without judgment and offering help without conditions, can alter the course of not just one life but generations to come. So the next time you see someone struggling, someone hiding, someone afraid, remember Kieran Holt and his simple statement, "I already know." Remember that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is not solving their problems for them, but standing beside them as they solve their own problems, offering support and love and the assurance that they do not have to face their challenges alone. And remember that love stories do not always begin with love at first sight or perfect circumstances or fairy tale romance. Sometimes they begin with fear and secrets, and loose dresses hiding growing bellies. Sometimes they begin with a cowboy who notices and says he already knows, and a woman brave enough to accept the help being offered. Sometimes the best love stories are the ones that start in darkness and create their own light, one small choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of kindness at a time, until the light they have created shines bright enough to illuminate not just their own path, but the paths of all who come after them. And that, in the end, is the legacy of Delilah and Kieran Holt, not just the children they raised or the ranch they built or the years they spent together, but the example they set of what it means to choose love over fear, compassion over judgment, hope over despair, and partnership over isolation. Their story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the transformative power of genuine love, and the truth that our circumstances do not have to determine our destiny. We all have the power to choose differently, to start over, to build something beautiful from broken pieces, to transform our deepest shame into our greatest strength. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, we find someone who sees us truly, who knows our secrets and loves us anyway, who offers their hand and their heart and says, "You do not have to do this alone. I am here. I choose you. I choose us." That is the real magic of Delilah and Kieran's story, the part that transcends time and place and specific circumstances to touch something universal in the human experience. We all want to be seen. We all want to be chosen. We all want to know that our past does not have to define our future, that mistakes can be redeemed, that broken things can be made whole. That love, when offered freely and accepted gratefully, has the power to transform everything. Their story is our story, or could be, if we are brave enough to be honest about our struggles, wise enough to accept help when it is offered, and loving enough to offer help to others without judgment or conditions. And as the sun sets over the New Mexico desert one more time, painting the sky in those eternal shades of beauty, their legacy continues, carried forward in the hearts and lives of all who know their story, a reminder that even in the wild and sometimes harsh landscape of life, love can take root and flourish, creating beauty that lasts for generations and hope that never dies. This is the story of Delilah and Kieran Holt, of a woman who hid her growing belly under loose dresses and a cowboy who noticed and said he already knew, of love that began in difficult circumstances and grew into something extraordinary, of a family built on choice and commitment rather than obligation, of a life well lived and a legacy well earned. And it is a reminder to all of us that our stories are still being written, that it is never too late for a new beginning, that help and hope and love can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a dramatic gesture but with a simple acknowledgement. I see you. I know your truth, and I choose to love you anyway.